This is a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, a floating city engineered to project absolute military dominance. Today, the United States commands the most powerful armed forces, the largest economy, and the most advanced technology on Earth. But rewind to 1776, and the picture was entirely different. The newly independent nation was essentially bankrupt, drowning in debt from the war against Britain. This map shows the core of their early economic paralysis. 13 individual states were all issuing their own separate war bonds and local currencies. A merchant in New York wouldn't accept a banknote from Virginia, making the financial system almost impossible to manage. So how did a fractured, uncreditworthy collection of colonies manage to climb out of that hole and eventually dictate the terms of the entire global system? America's rise did not happen by accident. It was the result of a highly calculated three-stage evolution in the technology of empire building. The first major fix came from Alexander Hamilton. He convinced the government to absorb all the individual state debts into a single national obligation. By centralizing the debt and reliably paying it off, the U.S. established immediate global creditworthiness, allowing them to finally borrow the money needed to expand. The real economic accelerator arrived during the World Wars. America realized a harsh truth about modern conflict. Fighting wars drains a nation's wealth, but supplying the weapons generates infinite capital. While European nations battered each other to pieces, America initially stayed neutral, doubling the capacity of its factories. They sold arms, machinery, and supplies to anyone with the cash or credit to buy them. By the time the fighting stopped, Europe's factories, roads, and rail lines were reduced to rubble. The complete physical destruction of European infrastructure meant America's main economic competitors were wiped off the board. Following the collapse of the Third Reich, the U.S. aggressively acquired Nazi Germany's brightest scientists. They absorbed top aerospace and weapons experts like Wernher von Braun, offering them citizenship and funding to build America's rocket programs. This matched an influx of brilliant refugee scientists like Albert Einstein, who had fled Europe earlier. This targeted brain drain shifted the center of global physics and research directly to the United States. By the end of the Second World War, America held a distinct advantage. They possessed the world's best scientific minds, while their rivals' industrial bases had been leveled. In 1944, the U.S. gathered the delegates from devastated nations at the Bretton Woods Conference. Because America held roughly 70% of the world's physical gold reserves at the time, they successfully pressured Europe to conduct international trade exclusively in U.S. dollars. The arrangement worked because the dollar was backed by a hard promise. Any nation holding American paper could exchange it for physical gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. But the U.S. printed far more dollars than it had gold to cover. When countries like France caught on and sent ships to collect their bullion, President Richard Nixon unilaterally severed the dollar's tie to gold. From that moment on, the global economy operated on fiat trust, paper backed only by faith in the U.S. government. Operating on pure trust made the new system vulnerable. We saw this during the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. When Arab states choked off supply, it triggered intense domestic inflation, leading to massive lines at gas stations across the country. To patch this vulnerability, Washington offered Saudi Arabia a deal. The U.S. military would guarantee the security and survival of the Saudi monarchy. In exchange, OPEC would price all global oil exclusively in U.S. dollars. This created the petrodollar. Because oil is the lifeblood of every economy, nations now had to stockpile American currency just to keep their lights on. It turned the dollar into a global utility that few countries could afford to ignore. Even with financial dominance, America still faced one heavily armed rival, the Soviet Union. The challenge was neutralizing a massive nuclear power without triggering a direct exchange. They found their answer in proxy warfare. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA funneled weapons and cash to arm insurgents in Afghanistan. These Mujahideen fighters engaged the Soviet army in a brutal, endless guerrilla war. The proxy war drained the Soviet treasury. Between the cost of the conflict and the pressure of the arms race, the Soviet economy buckled, leading directly to the dissolution of the state. With no military rivals left, America adapted its strategy again. Since the early days of personal computing, the U.S. has embedded its tech monopolies into the infrastructure of the globe. Most nations grew entirely dependent on American operating systems, software platforms, and social networks for their daily functions. When a nation's banking, communication, and social discourse happen on platforms owned by a single power, physical occupation becomes unnecessary. By owning the code that runs these systems, the US gained the ability to influence what people see and how their infrastructure functions from thousands of miles away. You can trace a clear line through this history. The United States transitioned its empire from conquering physical land to conquering global financial markets, to finally conquering digital infrastructure. By layering military, financial, and technological power on top of each other, the US built a system that can be aggressively weaponized. If a nation defies Washington's interests, America doesn't need to drop a bomb. They can deploy devastating economic sanctions. When you see Venezuelan bolívares held next to US dollars, you are looking at the direct result of trying to operate outside the US financial network. The resulting hyperinflation destroys isolated economies. That is the ultimate leverage. With a single directive, the US government can force tech and finance monopolies to revoke access to the dollar and essential software, instantly shutting down a foreign nation's banking system, power grid, and aviation networks. But as new economic coalitions begin to rise, seeking alternatives to the dollar, it raises a crucial question. Can a control system this deeply embedded in the world